Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about the exciting world of smart agricultural technologies. And so I'm going to introduce you to some of the key concepts and some of the global trends, and I'm going to mostly focus on examples of how smart technology might be used. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to identify what smart technology is, what smart farming might mean, and e-agriculture and similar sorts of terms. I'm hoping that you can provide examples of sensors used in crop and livestock production and how they might be used to help support management decisions. And then provide examples of actionable tools associated with using smart technologies and how they can support precision crop and livestock management. And lastly, I'm hoping that you can be aware of the trends in the handheld technologies that can support smart agriculture. So let's first talk about what smart agriculture is. And there's lots of synonyms to the word smart agriculture. It's also referred to as smart farming, digital agriculture, agriculture 4.0, and e-agriculture. There's a number of different definitions. I've talked with a lot of actual farmers and professionals, and they all provide me with different definitions of what smart agriculture is and what smart farming is. The FAO defines smart farming very simply as a farming management concept using modern technology to increase the quantity and quality of agricultural products. I think that smart farming is a little bit more than that. It starts to lean towards the application of the Internet of Things, which is basically connecting all of the different components through the Internet together to have automated decision making and automated sensing of what's going on in the environment. However, I think that perhaps smart farming is a little bit more than just the Internet of Things. So all the things that are connected to the Internet. Smart farming is defined through this Tech Target magazine as a management concept focused on providing the ag industry with infrastructure to leverage advanced technology, including big data, the cloud, and the Internet of Things for tracking, monitoring, automating, and analyzing operations. So I think that that's getting a little bit closer to what smart farming is. I tend to describe it as the combined use of sensors, data transmission and storage technologies, and automated data analysis to sense agricultural management units. So those could be crops, fields, livestock, greenhouses, and to generate output that might be acted on by managers or automated tools. So let's see what that means. So if we take a look at the components of a smart agricultural system, we'll start in the bottom left where you have the physical environment that we're measuring. So those are our management units. Those might be fields, they might be individual plants or sections of a greenhouse. It could also be livestock on the rangeland or in a controlled environment facility. So what we're talking about almost always with smart agriculture is that you have some kind of a sensor that's detecting what's going on in your management unit. Again, it's detecting what's going on with your crops or with your livestock. Those sensors will then send data over to analytical system that will interpret the data and either generate output that could result in an actionable instruction or a decision that's being made, or provide information. If you are in really advanced smart technology systems, those decisions will result in automated instructions that will send a robot out to actually act on the management unit that you were measuring in the first place. An example might be a moisture sensor in the field determining that a crop that the soil is too dry. It is sending that data to an interpretation system that then tells the irrigation system to go out and start watering. However, the more complex our system becomes and the greater the distance we're traveling sending information, the more we might be using specialized data transmission technologies. So cell phone towers, for example, and satellite data transmission. And that data might be transferred and stored in the internet. So in cloud-based storage systems, and that storage might be meshed with other data that's coming in from other sources that's bringing in a more comprehensive understanding of what's going on and feeding all of that into your analytical software. So for example, you might be detecting something going on in your field and might be coupled with other data sources, say weather data, and then all of that information gets fed to your analytical software that makes a decision or recommendation. Now, I think it's important to understand that it doesn't have to go, the information doesn't need to result in an instruction for a robot, that the information could be result in a decision that's being made by the producer that might take action themselves. So they might hop on the tractor themselves to go out in the field and do some corrective work. So that's essentially what smart agriculture is. It involves the sensing of the environment, the interpretation of that data, and that results in some sort of output of recommendation or instructions that can go out. So what are the goals of smart agriculture? We really want to be improving. We've talked a lot about agriculture and the impacts that it's having and some of the challenges that we have in terms of feeding the world. We want agriculture to be more efficient. We want it to have higher yields. We want it to use labor and resources more efficiently without polluting the environment. We want to improve animal welfare, improve product quality, and improve our sustainability in terms of soil health and our impact on the environment. So these sensing technologies can also be used to better understand how the ecosystem is functioning, how the soil, the characteristics of the soil and our impacts of management on the soil, as well as understanding crops and how they work, and finally with livestock as well. So let's take a look at some of the sensing technologies. So we're coming back to this little yellow box that's in the bottom left corner here. So we're looking at what kind of sensors actually exist that measure our management units and the characteristics of them. So if we start with just sensors in cropping systems, most people will be familiar that there's tons of different sensors that are out there that can measure lots of characteristics of the soil as well as of the plants. So you could be measuring soil moisture, soil fertility content, electrical conductivity, the air content or permeability in the soil. In terms of the plants, you could be measuring the color of the plant by the reflectance of light. You could be looking at the moisture status on the leaf surface that suggests disease susceptibility and so on. So there's lots of different sensors that are out there that gather information and then they feed that information into some sort of a transmission device. That transmission device could be sending data to a centralized data collection system that then will send data to your analytical station. So here's an example of a system that has a bunch of sensors that are spread out throughout a field and in different parts of a field, gathering data, sending the information in, and then the transmission system will send the data off to your computer. But sensors can also be sensing things remotely. So we're not just measuring things right in place in the field. You could be talking about sensing the environment from far away, such as from satellites, airplanes, or more commonly now, or more recently, I would say, drones. So the interesting thing is you can measure as you get closer to the ground surface, especially with drones, you can measure things with much greater precision and accuracy. And so you can gather data at a very fine resolution. Now there's lots of different sensors that you can attach to drones and satellites and planes that could take just snapshots, so visual pictures of what's going on, but they can also detect different wavelengths of reflection of light from the Earth's surface, and not just light, other wavelengths as well, in terms of beyond the visible spectrum. We might also look at LiDAR, and we'll talk about that perhaps a little bit later, and also release of heat from the soil through thermal imagery. So there's lots of different things that can be measured from a remote perspective. So let's talk about giving you an example of this. This is something called Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, and it's a measure of how healthy a plant is. And you can detect this by measuring the level of reflectance of light of different wavelengths, color wavelengths, from the surface of the plants. So usually our eye can detect if a plant is unhealthy or not by whether it's brown or yellow or green. And but a lot of the sometimes our eyes are not as in tune to detecting these differences, and also it's hard for us to scout a whole field in a lot of detail if you have a large area to scout. So you can send a drone out and actually measure the reflectance of light from your crop canopy, and depending upon the balance of near infrared, blue, green, and red light, you can determine if your crop is healthy or if it's under stress or if it's dead. Similarly, you can use the Normalized Difference Moisture Index to look at near infrared and shortwave infrared radiation and measure whether or not your crop is under moisture stress. So very interesting approaches to covering potentially a very large ground area quickly and identifying whether or not you have problems in your crop. I've seen greenhouses, large greenhouses, actually use this technology by flying a drone through their greenhouse to determine if there's stress. Here's another technology that some of the grain farmers that are in the class might relate to, and that is yield monitoring technology. So essentially the yield monitor on a combine harvester that you see here consists of a number of different components. First, there's something that actually measures the yield, so either the number of kernels that are coming in at a certain rate, so hitting an impact station or some sort of a weight measure. You also might need to have a moisture sensor because grain can contain different levels of moisture that will definitely affect the accuracy of your information. Then you need to have a global positioning system that will identify where your combine harvester is within the field. So you have these three sensors that are all working together to couple information in an analytical system that then produces an output, which is this yield data, yield map. And so you can see the yield map that's shown here. And it's very interesting to see where there's problem areas within your field, so where your crop is not doing very well and where your crop is performing really well. And then you can use this information to perhaps adjust your management practices in a more precise way in the different parts of the field. There's also soil mapping technologies that have developed. Normally we would go out and collect soil samples by physically taking samples or cores of soil from throughout a field. There's new technology that's being developed that can be attached directly to a tractor, such as this one that's being developed by Toyota. In terms of livestock, there's also lots of different sensors that are being used for livestock, including mechanical sensors that might be detecting the movement of animals, acoustic sensors that are detecting the sound within the barn and determining if their animals are under stress or if they're coughing and have disease potential problems. There's sensors that are being used to measure breath, and so they can measure volatile organic carbons. Step count and leg tilt, so that can indicate if an animal is agitated or if it's having some lameness issues. There's hormone measurements, temperature measurements that you can take, as well as movement, milk, saliva, and so on. So the list goes on. There's lots of sensors that you can place on the outside of the animals, or in some cases even on the inside, to actually measure what's going on with the animal, and then have those sensors send signals back to the operator so that they can deal with it. So how can we use all of these sensors to in precision management? And ultimately, we're trying to ensure that we're improving the welfare of the animals and optimizing the efficiency of their production. And so here's a few examples of how you can be using different kinds of sensors to help you with your livestock management system. You could use it to characterize your feed, the traits of the animals. You could use it to help with your energy budget planning, so the heating systems within a barn. You can measure environmental impact as well as air quality in the barn, so you could be perhaps measuring manure going out of the barn, gases that are being emitted like ammonia within the barn. Air quality issues are really important if you have confined spaces as well. You can determine, perhaps assess health of the animals very quickly and perhaps before you might otherwise recognize there's a problem. You also might use it to help with understanding the reproductive status of the animals. So you might know when an animal is going into heat so that you can perform artificial insemination at a proper time, or if they might be calving, for example. This is an example of a milk tracking system where milk is being collected from every cow automatically, and it's being analyzed and generating a ton of information about all of the milk that's being collected from every single cow. And you can identify whether, for example, there's mastitis in the cow by measuring the somatic cell count in the milk, and determine even perhaps what quarter of the udder the milk is coming from that is problematic. But you can also measure the yield and the quality of milk coming from every animal. Okay, so I want to give you an example of the ET Agricultural Brain by Alibaba. And so they've applied a lot of these technologies in a barn. And so I'm actually going to show you a YouTube video here. So very interesting how they've applied this technology and how they're actually measuring the lifestyle of the animal and using that information to be transferred right from the production of the animal right through to the package of meat that a consumer might buy. And so they have this traceability system of not only tracing the animal through the whole production system, but also informing the consumer as to whether the animal has had a healthy life or not. Very interesting. Okay, so let's look at precision crop management. And this is where we're talking a little bit more about the variable rate application of inputs. So if we have a very detailed yield map and soil maps, then we can very precisely apply where more fertilizer or less fertilizer, more or less seed in different parts of the field, or maybe even different types of seed. You can also have very targeted spraying technologies, weed mapping, and crop stand counts, and even guidance systems going around the field. So let's take a look at some examples of that. We know that there can be a lot of variability happening within a field, as you will have seen several maps now that I've just shown you that can show that the soil can be quite variable in terms of its characteristics, fertility characteristics, as well as perhaps its physical characteristics. And the crop's performance will be related to that. And if you understand the variability within a field, you can manage that variability much more efficiently by applying higher levels of fertilizer where the crop has a higher potential to grow, and reducing fertilizers in areas where there's less potential for growth. So that would be a great example of precision crop management. A lot of companies are now moving towards, aside from using yield monitors, they're also using drone technologies coupled with sensors and software and analytical systems to collect data, so different data like we've talked about previously, and using that to identify what's going on in the field in terms of your crop growth. Here's an example of a vineyard using the VineView system, and you can find out if there are problems within the vineyards. So, for example, thinner vegetation or perhaps dead plants in certain parts of the vineyard, and then you can manage accordingly. You can go and identify those plants. You can also identify disease points within your orchard or vineyard very quickly without having to go out and scout in person. And this allows you to be more proactive in terms of your disease management. You can also use sensors in different parts of your operation to identify areas that need specific management, such as irrigation. You also, the bottom photo here shows a slope gradient and how looking at thermal sensors, looking at temperature at the top of the hill versus the bottom of the hill. And you can monitor your temperatures to see if you have problems with cold weather and frost damage. So very interesting sensing technologies there. And you can apply similar sorts of approaches into field crops as well. I think one of the most rapidly adopted technologies relating to smart agriculture would be the automatic guidance systems that are being now being used in a lot of field equipment. And essentially this guidance system is using satellite GPS systems coupled with ground-based stations to refine the data so that you have very, very precise control over your positioning within a field. And we're talking about within a few centimeters. And this coupled with automatic steering systems allows you, if you have programmed the width of your implement that's behind you into the system, then it will map everywhere in the field that you are going and map the width, and it'll essentially automatically steer you through the field and ensure that you have minimal overlap, and so you're wasting very little time and inputs when you're operating. But it also allows the operator to operate in the field for much longer periods of time because they won't get as tired. Instead of having to steer and look and try and keep everything in line all the time, essentially you can be managing things, but you're not worried about steering constantly and paying attention all the time. So the automated steering systems are very, very precise. And my brother, he has planting rows that are 20 centimeters or so apart, and from one year to the next, he will plant, if these are the planting rows from this year, next year he will plant in between those two stubble rows to ensure that the seed is being placed well into the soil and avoid, have problems with the residue from the previous crop. So he can plant different seed rows in this automated steering system way very precisely. Spraying systems have also used this technology. So if you're mapping where you've sprayed, and this could apply to fertilizers as well, any input for that matter, as you work through the field, you'll map what parts of the field you have applied your input to. And then some of the newest technology is applying sectional control to the implement. So in this case, you have a sprayer that's has a big long spray broom, but you have different sections of the sprayer that can turn on or turn off as you go from one part of the field to the next. So this helps to avoid overlap of your inputs and creates much greater efficiency and reduces environmental risk. In smaller scale operations, or where the landscape is perhaps not as easy to manage, drones are now being used to apply inputs. It could be fertilizers or pesticides or biocontrols or so on. Okay, so let's take a look at some of some more tools that we can use. And robotic tractors might become much more common, allowing farmers to operate from the office essentially, and saving labor resources. So you get a tractor and send it out to the field. Once you've got a map of your field in place, these systems would most likely be equipped with sensors to determine if there's any obstruction or problem that they might run into, and automatically stop if there's a problem. And then the operator or the farmer can come out and take a look. So robotic tractors might be in our future. What's already being used are camera systems that might assist with weeding operations. So here the camera is detecting the position of different plants within a crop, or sometimes it'll be rows of a crop, and it'll adjust weeding tools to go around the plants or stay in the rows, and allowing you to do much more precise weeding operations. We're also seeing the development of new robotic weeders, so you could have robots going out into your field and automatically weeding all of the time, even without the operator being present. So it could be using electrical controls to zap the weeds, or a herbicide application, or even a mechanical removal process. So there's different mechanisms of weed control, but the robots are definitely becoming starting to be developed. And they're being developed for use in small scale, small vegetable gardens to large vegetable operations to larger orchards and vineyards. Our own lab here, our engineering department, is working on artificial intelligence technologies and deep learning to basically train computer systems to identify, using a camera, to identify different types of plants as you're moving through the field, and then targeted using once those plants are identified, you can use targeted herbicide applications to control unwanted plants. And so this can greatly reduce the amount of pesticide that's being used in the field, and so reducing your cost and environmental impact. So here's an example of that, where a plant or a weed has been detected, and you can see the spray pattern that has sprayed only the grassy weed that you see here. And you can also use drones to deliver biocontrols. So this is an example from Quebec, where they're using drones to deliver trichogramma wasps throughout a cornfield on a grid pattern, so that they can control European corn borer in the cornfield biologically. Some of the new systems can also be monitoring pest pressure, so you could have yellow sticky traps in the field that are detecting the presence of pests such as moths, and then that could automatically trigger hormone disruption technologies that will spread hormones into the air that will disrupt mating of the moths. These systems can also be gathering detailed climate information and leaf moisture information to identify whether or not there's a risk of disease incidents or other pest pressure. What I find is really cool is new technologies that are being used with harvesting. And so it takes a lot of labor to harvest a lot of fruits and vegetables. And some of the new robotic systems are actually being designed to use camera sensors to take an image of the fruit and be able to detect its level of ripeness from its color, and then actually using a robot arm to actually pick the fruit. So here's an example in tomatoes. And here's another example where a robotic picking system is being used for apples. So you only pick the apples that are actually ripe. And this one is interesting, where you actually have a strawberry picker. But it's harder for a sensor to actually see all the strawberries, so you have to have a mechanism of picking up the leaves and exposing the fruit so that the harvester can actually determine whether or not the berry is ripe. We also have harvesting systems for cattle, for milk cows. And so we are seeing robotic milkers are becoming much more common in a lot of farms, dairy farms. And this does relieve the labor pressure for during milk times. It also allows cows to come and be milked more frequently and when they feel they need it. So basically, the cow would walk into this small stall, and the robot would automatically detect from the tag or the necklace of the neckband of the cow what the identity of the cow is, whether or not it should be in there for milking, and then it will automatically go about cleaning the udder and then and doing the milking. And as it's milking, it will collect all of the data from each quarter of the udder to measure the milk production from every single cow and the quality of the milk sometimes even as well. But this robotic milking system has gone even further for pasture-based systems where you don't want to have cows always walking back to the barn to get milked. They've actually moved the robotic milker into the field, so you have a robotic milking parlor. And this parlor will actually move with the cows through the field. And so the cows never have to go back to the barn for milking. This is definitely more efficient. The cows spend less time walking and more time grazing and digesting. So we know that there's a lot of new technologies. Anybody who has a cell phone, and almost all of us have a cell phone now, know that there's tons of apps that you can get for your phones. And there's lots of apps that are actually available to support agricultural decision making. So for example, you can use your camera to help you with identification of the fertility level of your leaves. And so here you're measuring the level of greenness, which is the indication of whether or not you have a nitrogen deficiency. Some of these technologies are really good for identifying diseases, and so you can take a picture of a diseased leaf and it will actually detect what the problem is or direct you to a resource. Here's the same software being used to identify a nutrient deficiency in a leaf. So this is a phosphorus deficiency in tomato. And this is being used in a wide variety of ways. So you can use it to help identify weeds, identify any kinds of plants, and even insect pests. And it could help you to assess the level of damage to that's being created by insects or diseases, as well as the identification of them. And you can even use the data, use it to help identify, count the number of pests in a yellow sticky trap. This tool I found really fascinating. This is still under development as far as I know, but it's basically an analytical system that's being attached to your cell phone. So you get the software for it, and this little attachment goes onto the phone. And you're measuring a problem called late blight, which is a problem in potatoes and tomatoes, which we're very familiar with, especially in potato production in PEI in New Brunswick. So essentially you take a leaf, you put it into the little jar there, and while the leaf is respiring in the jar for 10 or 15 minutes, it's releasing volatile organic compounds, and which have basically a signal that can be detected by the software in the phone. So you have the analytical system that detects whether or not those volatile organic compounds are an indicator of the disease being present. So this allows you to identify the disease earlier and perhaps get out and treat the plants more quickly. And this is kind of a common technology that we are very valuable, I guess, technology, whether it's for livestock or for crop production. If you can identify problems more effectively and efficiently and sooner than what you might see if you're just doing regular scouting, then you can perhaps get on top of the problem before it becomes too large and requires a really major intervention. The technology is also really cool because consumers can use it. And now there's, by using QR codes and scanning technologies on cell phones, you can have much improved traceability systems through the entire value chain, right from the animal or the plant straight through the whole production system to the consumer. And the consumer can actually use that information to gather that QR code to gather more detailed information about the products and what they might contain and how the product might have been produced. So, in conclusion, the capabilities and applications of smart ag technologies are definitely growing rapidly. I think there's huge potential for no matter what discipline you're going into, whether it's environmental sciences or crop production or livestock production. I think you're going to see more and more opportunity to use smart technologies. And I encourage you to start trying to keep track of trends of these technologies within your discipline. Because they are going to evolve very quickly as our computing power continues to grow. And you might even be, I think one of the keys here is that we need to be able to interpret the data correctly. So we need to understand what data we're collecting, how it relates to how the plants or animals are growing, or the stressors that might be there, or the environmental impacts that we're having. And we need to take that data and interpret it and ensure that the analytical systems are interpreting it correctly and producing useful information for us. But I think that we will see as we start to gather more and more data through these smart agricultural systems, there's going to be huge amounts of data that are collected. The potential is huge. And this leads to data storage issues. It'll mean that you'll have to have much bigger storage systems either on your phone or your computer or on server systems. And especially in those server systems, and huge data storage centers, they require a lot of energy to keep them cool. So there is an environmental impact by collecting excess data. So I think that it's definitely something that you should be continuing to pursue. I think we need to be pursuing more local case studies of how these smart technologies can be applied in crop management, soil management, and livestock management. And I provided a couple recommendations here in terms of organic production, but it can go elsewhere as well. I think we can use these tools to better understand the environment that we are working within and to optimize our productivity within the environment. So I think that that's one of the key things that we could be doing with this technology, aside from more precise and efficient management of our inputs. All right, so if you have any questions about that lecture, feel free to send an email off to me, and I'd be happy to chat about it with you some more.